Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week, we bring you leading experts for a lively discussion on topics related to strategic nuclear deterrence. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the hosts and the guests are their own.
Welcome to another exciting episode of NucleCast. Of course, I am your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have Brigadier General and Doctor Rob Spalding, who is a former B-2 pilot. You were the defense attaché, correct, in Beijing?
Yep.
Served in the Trump White House as on the National Security Council, and China expert. You speak Chinese, you speak Mandarin. For those of you that don't know Rob, so Rob and I are friends, and I've known him for quite a while. And I always found him to be one of the most impressive Air Force officers that I had ever met. Incredibly smart, incredibly capable. Now he's retired, and he's the CEO of a company called SEMPRE that is making EMP hardened infrastructure, 5G equipment, data center equipment. What all else does SEMPRE do?
It basically gives you the ability to use your phone, continue to use your phone through a new EMP, which, given we had a just Chinese balloon float over at 60,000 feet, gives you some indication of the threat that we face.
It does. And our adversaries, and that's what we're going to talk about today, because you and I have worked a lot about Chinese issues in the past, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to talk China again. And you've written 2 books about the Chinese threat. Some people, your critics, and we all have critics, I know I have quite a few, have, often say, that we're too much, both you and I were accused of being too much of panda sluggers and not enough of panda huggers. But I think we have been borne out over time as being correct. And your latest book, which I enjoyed it on, I listen to a lot of audio books while I'm at the gym. And so you were on my gym list for a few weeks. And I thought your analysis of unrestricted warfare was spot on and fantastic. So for those listeners who haven't read either of Rob's books, pick them up on Amazon or Kindle, or I audio book them. So those were great. So thanks for doing that. I think it was informative to folks who don't really understand sort of the intricacies and the allegorical nature of Chinese strategic thinking and sort of the hindsight bias. And this, whenever I tell people that the Chinese constantly look back, like Xi reads, the annals of the autumn and spring periods, that they're like, huh? Why would he do that? That's because it's not our way. So could you maybe start out by giving us a better understanding of how and what guides Chinese strategic thinking and their strategic ambition?
Yeah, there's actually a good, and I talk about it in Stealth War, a good little, what I would call almost a monograph. It was really a book called A Treatise on Efficacy. And the guy that wrote it, French guy, really just analyzes the Western strategic mind and the Chinese strategic mind, and he compares and contrasts them. And there's an interesting quote in there where he talks about the difference of strategy from the West and the East, and so the way to think about that is we tend to shape the world around us. So we have an objective, and we muster our resources, and we drive towards that objective. And then the Chinese sort of think about, where is the world going, and how do I make myself comport to the trends that are being established and then how do I take advantage of, kind of be carried away by them. And so I think that really that the way that's been applied in the modern context is globalization, the internet. So, and I think unrestricted warfare does a good job of explaining the opportunities of globalization and the internet, and how the Chinese Communist Party, from a doctrinal perspective, at least in terms of thinking militarily, a military competition that goes beyond military, how do they essentially conform to the trends of the time and allow themselves to take advantage of those things by being carried away by them. And so that's one way of looking at it. Another way to look at it that I use frequently is Simon Sinek's idea of infinite versus finite games. I think the Chinese Communist Party thinks more in an infinite game, which Simon Sinek says a player in an infinite game seeks to continue to be in a player. In a finite game, there's winners and losers. There's a specific time period for the game. In an infinite game, there's no time period, and there's no winners and losers. And so I think that's the other important difference between the two. And then they do study. Mao studied. Xi studies. They all the Chinese leaders study ancient Chinese history. And I think one of the reasons that the Communist Party does this is because it is primarily a political. When they think of competition or conflict, it's thought of in a political sense. So, where Clausewitz says war is politics by other means, to them politics is war. It is, and so political warfare is the main way of thinking. And if you think about political warfare, just kind of as a way it's practiced, it is the same things are recurring throughout human history. It is politics is a human endeavor, and so studying ancient China really, in terms of human interactions, isn't really that different from today. Politics is politics throughout the ages, and I think one of the things I talk about is if you're going to look at a book that kind of from the Western perspective that kind of mirrors how the Chinese Communist Party looks at the world, it's Machiavelli's The Prince. I think that's if you use that book as a way to think about how the Chinese Communist Party thinks about the world, then I think you would be much better served.
Now, as we think about Chinese strategy, and there's a lot of misunderstanding, and the example I always like to give is at the end of the Cold War, the KGB went back to Russia, and in Berlin they left all their files. So German scholars quickly came in and looked at them. They saw the Russian war, the Soviet war plan, and that included nuclear attacks on the 5 largest German cities, as sort of a effort at a fiat accompli, escalate to de-escalate. And the challenge for the U.S., and the U.S. had more than 4,000 professional Sovietologists, is we got it completely wrong, in that we thought they were going to engage in this massive conventional assault through the Fulda Gap, and that was our view of their strategy. And we were wrong. They were going to go nuclear first. And if we can get the Russians wrong when we have that many devoted Sovietologists who speak the language and understand culture and all that, then my question is, how much more wrong are we about the Chinese, who are so much more fundamentally different? And so you, having a great deal of experience with the Chinese, you understand them better than most. So what are some of the ways that you think that we get the Chinese wrong, particularly in things, for example, like in how we understand their no first use policy? What does active defense mean? What are their ambitions?
Yeah, I think the first thing that you have to recognize, and I say this, and it's kind of in the title of my book, War Without Rules, is the understanding. And the Chinese Communist Party are extremely clear about this point, and that is the rules established by the West don't really apply to us. They're in essence, they're designed to prop up the West. And so if we play a game according to their rules, we're going to lose. And so anything that we think about with regard to strategic deterrence I mean, there's a lot of knowledge built up there. Of course, that was based on the U.S. and Allied versus Soviet Cold War. I think we have to throw that completely out the door, because the surest thing that you will get wrong with the Chinese will be if you try to model our nuclear posture vis-a-vis the Chinese with the same kind of way that we looked at the Soviets. We have to basically throw all that away. We don't know what the Chinese are going to do. What we do know is that they've said the rules don't apply to them. And so one of the things that's played out over the years is this constant effort on the part of America to get the Chinese to enter into some kind of strategic dialogue, because that's what we know with the Soviets. They're not going to enter, and even if they did enter into strategic dialogue with the United States, whatever agreement came out of that, they don't feel bound to. And I think you have to work with the Chinese, not just the government, but just the Chinese nationals, to understand that contracts don't mean what they do. So rule of law, which guides how we deal with things. So you have a contract with somebody, you expect them to honor the contract. A contract with a Chinese national is meaningless. It really has no meaning, and particularly the Chinese state is not going to enforce a contract in the way that you would expect, say, a court in the West to. So everything that you think about when the West has kind of built these institutions and these rules of the road, you have to throw them completely out. And the way I look at it, the way China is trying to reshape the world today, we talk about a rule-based world. Right, that's the Western liberal democrat order. We want to engage China to bind them to the rule-based world. That you cannot, when you deal with the Chinese Communist Party, it is on the basis of interests, and you have to think of everything that you do with China and the Chinese Communist Party on the basis of interest. So you have to think of an interest-based world. That's a completely, fundamentally different way of dealing. It's much more akin to kind of balance of power. And so if you start to think in those terms, you're much better equipped. Now, what the problem that we have right now is that we have all these allies and partners, and we've created this rule-based world, and then we invited the Chinese into that. And so because they don't abide by that, they're fouling it up. They're destroying it. So things like that we're getting into with China right now regarding trade. We end up having fights with the Europeans because we're trying to deal with everybody on the basis of, hey, the Chinese don't play by the rules, so we have to play different. We have to have tariffs, across the board. And I think what we did with the Soviets is much more, would be much more effective. And that is just say, Soviets, you go over there. You have your economy, you have your political system, you have everything, and then we're going to separate. We're going to completely separate, and then we are going to ensure that we maintain the rules-based order and ensure that we're prosperous and free. And then over time, by not having access to that, I think they will decline. But throw out everything that you think about with regard to geopolitics when you think of the Chinese, because they don't understand, abide by, or will ever insert themselves into a rule-based world in a way that you can understand.
Now, as you think through how they think about nuclear weapons, because that's part of, what SEMPRE does, is it's, you've built a company that seeks to address a potential threat, an EMP threat from Russia or China. So how should the listeners of this show understand what the Chinese in particular think about the use of nuclear weapons and their role in national security and strategy?
Well, I think they first of all, they have some asymmetric capabilities. One of the things that we talk about is EMP. And so that, because they don't play by the rules, so if you go back to kind of how we establish our posture vis-a-vis the Soviets, It was much more based on kind of an offensive capability. We recognize that, based on everything that they were building, that we wanted to create an offensive capability to deter them from using weapons. I think when you look at the Chinese, you actually have to take more of a defensive posture. In other words, they could potentially use these things in very asymmetric ways. You have to prepare yourselves, and you have to be ready to absorb that and not let it become the disruptor. So kind of like what you were alluding to with the Soviets, where that we had discovered that they were going to use nuclear weapons very asymmetrically. I would plan for the Chinese to do so as well. They're going to use that as something to create an advantage that they can then exploit. So thinking of nuclear weapons as kind of the mutually assured destruction mindset with China just isn't going to work. I think you have to take a much more defensive posture, understand, how these things could be used in more of a psychological, again, political warfare, psychological warfare. COVID was a psychological weapon, not to say that the Chinese deliberately released COVID to be a psychological weapon. It's just they used the opportunity to create and spread fear. So if you think of what nuclear weapons represent, they represent fear. They are a psychological weapon. This is a thing that all the basis of nuclear strategy is based on this idea of a nuclear weapon is a psychological weapon, and so the Chinese Communist Party will seek to use that as a psychological weapon.
Yeah, I often like to describe the Chinese as a lot like water, where they will flow wherever the opportunity presents itself, and where we, the Americans, will look at a mountain and say, well, what are we going to do? Well, the mountain's in our way, so we're either going to take the mountain down.
We'll just cut a hole through
it. Whereas the Chinese will say, well, what if we went around the mountain? That would be the easiest thing to do, and we can still get, where we want to go. So it's a very different way of thinking about it. Now, you are working on EMP, and the big issue for you for EMP is that much of our, our electrical grid, our infrastructure is not EMP hardened. And given our dependencies on, P and position navigation and timing with GPS system, with our digital infrastructure, we face significant threats that would be catastrophic if we could have a high altitude EMP detonation that could wreak havoc on our infrastructure without killing anybody, in a nuclear detonation and releasing, tons of ionizing radiation and contaminating stuff. But we could do equal damage with that EMP. So can you perhaps lay out the threat as you see it and what you think are some of the solutions to that?
Yeah. So, having grown up in the nuclear force, we, when I say we, I mean the nuclear force has the ability to continue to operate through a nuclear attack, to include EMP. That's the way because we have to. One of the things that I have seen as a challenge ever since, and it's really the thing that got me thinking about this, was Hurricane Katrina. And if you look at what happened to Hurricane Katrina, you had widespread loss of power, you had widespread loss of communications, and when that happened, you lost civil society pretty quickly. And so, and then there's of course there's a great fiction out there called 1 Second After. So think about Katrina across the United States, and then how do we maintain order? So yes, our nuclear forces maintain on alert, and they're postured, and they can respond. But the country is descending into basically chaos, because that's what's going to happen if we lose the grid and if we lose our communication system. And I think what's more important of the two, between the grid and the communication system, is the communication system. I think we could lose the grid. But if we can communicate with the populace and maintain calm and let them know that help's on the way and that we're doing what we need to do, that's far more able to keep things going than if we just lose the grid if we lost the grid and communications, I think that's when you really get the descent of civil liberties into disorder. And I think that's the biggest threat. And consequently, that means that a nuclear power doesn't need to be, have 1,500 nuclear weapons or 3,000 nuclear weapons. They just need a couple with the ICBM capability to, launch them over the top of the United States and essentially take down the grid. And now we've got huge problems that the nuclear forces aren't designed to solve. Even Northcom is not designed to solve it. When you look at Northcom's forces, when it comes to communications and power, are private companies. And as you know, private companies aren't required to be prepared for any kind of attack. And we see, whether it be hurricanes or the bombing in Nashville of the AT&T switching center that took down Tennessee's cell network for 2 weeks, we're just not robust and resilient and survivable for that. And so, when I say defensive, I think that's one of the things that America needs to look at. And there's been congressional study after congressional study saying this is a problem. We need to do something about it. And of course, just like most things, we just neglect it.
So we're at that point in our show where we have to take a quick break, and we are talking with Rob Spalding, CEO of SEMPRE, retired B-2 pilot, and we will be right back. This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. Okay, and we're back, and we're talking with Rob Spalding. So you're talking about EMP and the challenges that we have, that we're not hardened and we don't have a resilient infrastructure. Now, I can imagine that this is one of those topics that would have a big bill. It's kind of like infrastructure. If we want to get the bridges and roads fixed, that's a big bill. So if we want to make our infrastructure resilient, I would assume that whatever that cost is going to be is some astronomical number. Do you have a sense of what it would take to prepare for an EMP attack?
So what we did is take. So one of the things that the paper that I wrote when I was at the White House on 5G, the concept there was that 5G was bringing most of the infrastructure into software. And that gave us an opportunity to begin to think differently about architecture. So what SEMPRE did was take 5G as a technology and then envision how, if we had a clean sheet of paper, we might redo the architecture of how we build infrastructure. And when you do it that way, actually, SEMPRE's on a path right now where we're as cost effective as current infrastructure. We are on a path to drive that cost down below what current infrastructure costs to deploy. And so I think the concept that it's going to cost you, it's going to be enormously, exorbitantly expensive. Not only is it going to be not going to be more expensive, it's actually going to be cheaper than the way we build infrastructure today, and it's more resilient. So I think the way we have done EMP hardening in the past, and the way DoD currently does EMP hardening, I lived this in the B2, is that we try to harden things after they're designed, rather than building EMP hardening into the overall design of the architecture. And I think when you do that, what we found was that building it in from the beginning really makes it, the additional cost is negligible. And then using the ability that 5G gives you, which is to share infrastructure amongst multiple different tenants. So the military can share with commercial, much like we share the freeways now with the Eisenhower National Highway System. We don't send military vehicles down some military road. They go down the freeway just like all the other, civilian traffic does. I think when you start to look at infrastructure in more of a shared format, which is what 5G allows you to do, now you can build infrastructure that's not even more more capable, more resilient, and more cost effective, both for the military and for the civilian sector. So, that's what 5G brought to, as a technology created an opportunity to kind of rethink. And I think that's the opportunity that I tried to talk about at the White House that really telecom industry wasn't really interested in hearing about. But I think from a business perspective, it gave me an opportunity to retire and go out and seek to actually establish that you could do this. And that's what we've done. We've already built the infrastructure and we're beginning to deploy it now. So, if you think about it from, what we always say about our competition with China, it's American innovation that's going to allow us to compete. Well, in this case, American innovation is allowing us to compete by thinking differently about how we build infrastructure.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting topic because it reminds me of, in many respects, for Africa, they're not going to go and build, like a legacy phone system so that they can then build, a cell network. They're just going to skip all the legacy stuff and go straight to the latest technology. Right. That's sort of the benefit of not being the first mover. And so it seems that when you are always the first mover and you're the one developing the infrastructure and then building it out, you then have a lot of financial interest in that legacy infrastructure that keeps you from, being willing to just sort of dump it and move on to whatever the next generation is. And as I listen to you, I sort of think that's what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think so. The way we're looking at it is, at least initially, we don't believe that we should replace all of our infrastructure with SEMPRE nodes, but we do believe that if there's areas of the country or communities or continuity of government, continuity of operations for military bases that you want to ensure is survivable and continues to operate through any type of attack, then that would be an appropriate place to put this. And then over time, by thinking of infrastructure in this way, we will slowly get more resilient. One of the things about our cell networks today is that we have highly centralized architecture. In other words, if you lose connection to the brains of the network, you can have tens of thousands of cell towers that just don't operate because they don't have connection to the core. And so what we've tried to do is say, okay, every node has to have a core, has to have brains. So if that is operating as part of more of a centralized network, say that centralized connection is cut, well, the nodes themselves continue to operate as kind of isolated nodes in the event something happens. And that's how you're able to build resiliency without actually having to replace everything.
And this is really pretty interesting and sort of important for nuclear command and control because, my belief is that our adversaries are going to launch, before they launch nuclear weapons, they're going to probably launch cyber attacks. They're going to launch space attacks to try to blind us and deafen us. And so maintaining capable nuclear command and control, is sort of the be all end all of our ability to operate our nuclear infrastructure and the nuclear weapons. So do you see this being something that can be done in the face of, advanced cyber attacks? You mentioned SEMPRE nodes that they're going to be EMP resilient, but how do you see our infrastructure, both, sort of what y'all are doing and then where we are in its resiliency to these sort of initial cyber attacks and other efforts to make us deaf and blind?
Right. So I think because we're highly centralized, then anywhere from the brain all the way out to the radio to the antenna, you have opportunities to insert yourself to collect information. And so by driving all of the infrastructure in the software, what 5G allowed you to do was kind of combine that into a single node and then harden that node. So now all of these places that you can go along in the United States to kind of, siphon out data, they are now collapsed into a single node. And then once you treat that node like a tamper-proof encrypted node, getting into it is very hard. And then when you communicate from node to node, if that's encrypted, it becomes very, very hard to break into it. So think of each SEMPRE node as a SCIF. And each SCIF doesn't have any people in it that want to watch cable TV, so they drill a hole in the side. In fact, we monitor the inside to make sure that the case isn't penetrated. Now it becomes very difficult anywhere to insert yourself. And then if you want to, say, air gap certain communications and ensure that the way that you talk node to node is, say, through a secure satellite communication, now, or maybe even HF, now you have the ability to create a highly secure, hardened infrastructure that runs right alongside your cell towers. You could not do that with a centralized architecture because, any time that you're moving data to, the brain so that it can route it wherever it needs to go, you're creating vulnerabilities in terms of the ability to take data out. And then from SCADA systems, whether it be water or power, having the ability to prevent, that SCADA system from having access to the internet. You can do that too by saying, hey, it's going to have access to the SEMPRE node. All the compute that's needed to run the applications that drive that SCADA network is going to be there, and we're not going to give that access to the internet. So these are the things that you can begin to do when you build your architecture in this way.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, and so we're at the end of the show. And before we go, I wanted to just give you that final word. As we talked about Chinese strategy and nuclear weapons, and then we talked about EMP attack, and now we're talking about how do you sort of build capability to defend against it. As our listeners try to process, sort of the breadth of the show today, what do you think is the important takeaway for them to walk away from listening to this show with? What should they know?
Well, first of all, nuclear weapons are highly relevant when it comes to our competition with China, but we have to begin to think differently. I think we need to think more in terms of defensively, and we have to think more in terms of psychologically. These weapons can be used as psychological weapons, and the Chinese Communist Party will seek to do that. And so understanding that the Chinese think very differently about warfare and how that impacts our nuclear posture, both from an offensive perspective, but also from a defensive perspective, I think is very important.
All right. Well, I will give you the last word. I want to thank Brigadier General retired Rob Spalding, the CEO of SEMPRE. If you want to learn more about him or his company, you can go to their website, which is, of course, on the internet. So go there. Thanks, Rob, for joining us. I think we'll have you back in the future.
Thanks, Adam.
This is a great topic, and I think many people are sitting there wanting more, but unfortunately, time is against this. So thanks for joining us, and thanks to you, the listeners, and we'll see you on the next episode.
This has been a production of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Our executive producer is Kimberly Charrington, and this episode has been engineered and mixed by David Krumthal. Follow the show on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at Nuclearcast. Listen, follow, and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.